Hi, I'm not John Green, but we couldn't afford him, so you're stuck with me. The Vietnam War protest was a movement to end US involvement in Vietnam. They started in 1960, but only the minority of the US public was actually for the movement. Most of them were against the idea of no US involvement. The Vietnam War technically started on November 1st, 1945, but the US only got involved in 1955. They took 10 years to get involved and another 5 years to realise that was a mistake. It happened during the Cold War, and it was what we call a proxy war, meaning the US and the USSR were not taking direct part in the fighting. Examples of another war could be the Korean War. To start with, they just supplied weapons, the US to the south and the USSR to the north. The war caused many civilian casualties, and around 1 in 10 American soldiers were wounded or killed. The origin of the war dates back to World War II, when Japan invaded Vietnam, a French colony at the time. Communist leader Ho Chi Minh wanted to make Vietnam independent, and so the Viet Minh, League for the Independence of Vietnam, was born. When Japan left Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh saw the opportunity to seize it, and the northern city of Hanoi was captured, declaring the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV, leaving the south of Vietnam to the French-influenced Emperor Bao Dai. This started two factions, the DRV with Hanoi as its capital and ruled by Ho Chi Minh, and the state of Vietnam with Saigon as its capital and ruled by Bao Dai and backed by France. Thus, the Vietnam War started. Both North and South wanted a unified Vietnam, however, the North wanted a communist-influenced state, whereas the South was more influenced by the capitalist West. Though a treaty was signed splitting Vietnam in half in 1954, it did not last very long, and in 1955, anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem became the president of South Vietnam. Thus, given the conditions of the Cold War, President Dwight Eisenhower supported Diem, as any Soviet ally was deemed an enemy. This is how US involvement in Vietnam started, where training and weapons were sent to South Vietnam. Though the war was small-scale, this changed in 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin, where North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked US destroyers. President Lyndon Johnson retaliated, bombing key targets, and was given power to declare war, even though in the end he didn't actually do that. Since most of the American public agreed, US troops were sent to Vietnam on a large scale. However, this escalation, along with no clear publicly made objective for the war and no official declaration, started the beginnings of the anti-war movement. People who voted against US involvement were the minority of the general public, usually intellectuals in college circles. The protests against US involvement evolved from around 1960 in college campuses, with their main goal being to withdraw all US soldiers from Vietnam and to unite the American public in order to fight against the war. The protests increased in size and potency as the war developed due to many reasons. For example, a North Vietnamese campaign called the Tet Offensive in 1967 proved that the end of the war wasn't close to coming soon, though the government kept trying to convince the public otherwise. The US was also spending $25 billion per year on the war, most of which was tax money gathered from the public. As you can imagine, people were not too happy about this, as that money could have been better used in public institutions. Now, take a look at this highly realistic and historically accurate reenactment.
And that should cover your $25 billion for this year?
That's only $5 billion, not 25.
Give me 1 second.
Have you been hearing about that Vietnam?
Yeah, take that. Can I have yours, please?
No, sir.
What was that?
Alright. Taking our tax monies away?
Yeah,
What is this?
What? Hey, sorry about that. This should cover the $25 billion.
Yes, it does.
Alright, thank you. Good. Back to war with you. Go on.
Oh, okay.
Other factors that contributed to the heightening of the protests were draft lotteries. The US drafted more and more people into the war, totaling around 40,000 people being called into service every month by 1967. Despite the fact that being drafted into the war was mandatory, there were many people who refused, and one notable one was Muhammad Ali. the boxer. His refusal ended up in him being given a prison sentence, but the Supreme Court overruled it and he didn't end up serving any of those years. However, he was banned for boxing for 3 years, which I imagine sucked for him. Oftentimes, people would dodge or actively refuse drafts which harmed the recruitment effort for soldiers, part of a larger method of protest of actively hindering the war effort. According to Bill Zimmerman, a leader in the anti-war movement, troop trains were impeded, campus protesters blocked access to the military and CIA recruiters, clergy members dumped blood on draft reports, and hippie organisers manipulated the media with attention-grabbing stunts. To start with, the protests were just against US involvement in Vietnam, but they eventually evolved into full-on demonstrations against war as a whole. The biggest ones of these took place on October 21st, 1967, and consisted of around 100,000 people. They all gathered around the Lincoln Memorial for the protest, and 30,000 of them later marched to the Pentagon, continuing the demonstration. This got so huge that soldiers got involved, rather ironically, and hundreds of protesters were arrested. Take a look at our highly paid actors representing the march.
End the war before it ends you. Hey, LBJ, how many kids do you kill today?
We need to have an HUAC meeting. If we think anyone's working with the Viet Cong, we investigate them.
I'll agree.
End the war. End the war.
Arrest them!
End the war. End the war.
Hey, you two are coming with me. Go.
Hey, go. Out.
So apparently there are 300,000 more of them.
Arrest 48 of them. From January 1968 started one of, if not the most, intense period of anti-war protests and marches. In March 1968, more than 400 people were shot down by US soldiers in the My Lai massacre in a village called Sun Mai in South Vietnam. This war crime and many others, such as bombings or the use of Agent Orange, sparked even more protests, marches, and increased the numbers of protesters. The SDS organisation, Students for a Democratic Society, was also in its peak during that time, conducting anti-war marches, sit-ins, and mass student strikes. Polls in early February showed that only 35% of the American public was in favour of the constant drafting of soldiers, 50% of the public was against it, and the other 15% very helpfully didn't do anything. Additionally, members of the VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War organisation, who were all veterans, publicly threw away their medals. This won even more people over to the cause. In 1968, we also see Richard Nixon winning the presidency, with his war policies dividing the country even further. According to those policies, draft lottery was instituted in December 1969, and the National Guard troops shot demonstrators in Kent State in 1970, killing 4 students during a mass student strike where 500 universities shut down. Though Nixon started a program called Vietnamization to get soldiers out of Vietnam, whilst letting South Vietnam still be able to defend itself, the government was still dishonest with the people and continued bombings and attacks until Nixon declared the end of US involvement in 1973. We cannot attribute the end of US involvement in Vietnam solely to the protests, however, as Nixon himself showed his disinterest in the protests through the silent majority speech. The protests did, however, influence Congress to cut funding and press the troop withdrawals. A larger consequence of the protests was that the relationship between the government and the people changed. The American public started seeing the government as lying and selfish. Additionally, it created a split between the liberal Americans and the patriot Americans, those who followed the government. Strong anti-war sentiment had spread in countries such as Australia and New Zealand, whose anti-war movements used similar kind of aims, tactics, and methods. 100,000 people hit Bourke Street in Melbourne, Australia, for a moratorium march in the early 1970s. These protests managed to get Australian troops out of Vietnam and release previously arrested protesters. So, would you have protested the immorality of the Vietnam War and risked arrest, or sided with Nixon's office amidst a huge anti-war sentiment? That's all. Thanks for watching, and we won't be seeing you next week. This video was sponsored by nobody, we don't have any money, and buy our invisible merch. Goodbye.